Good morning and welcome to the second installment of Bracewell's Fall 2020 Virtual Environmental Seminar. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Whit Swift in Bracewell's Austin office, and I'm joined this morning by Jeff Holmstead in our Washington, D.C. office. And our topic today is the next 4 years and what will we be seeing under the Clean Air Act with this new Biden administration. We look forward to discussing this with you this morning. Hope you find it interesting. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to Jeff to start us off.
Well, thanks, Whit. I wanted to set the stage before we dive into the nitty-gritty of some of the Clean Air Act issues. I'm not quite sure how I became a grizzled old veteran in Washington, D.C., but I've lived through a number of transitions, both inside and outside the government. I was actually in the George H.W. Bush White House during the transition to the Clinton administration, and left my desk in the White House at noon on January 20th of that year. And then when George W. Bush took over from the Clinton administration, I was at EPA and part of that transition process. And although I was not officially involved in the transition from Obama to the Trump administration, I was certainly paying careful attention and talking to people who were in the middle of all of that. So I like to believe I have a pretty good understanding of what we're likely to see, not only during the transition, but in the first 100 days of a Biden administration. And we are assuming at this point that's what we'll have, in part because if we have a second Trump administration, it won't be nearly as interesting as it will almost certainly be under a Biden administration. For any of you who've been paying attention, I'm sure you've seen by now that the Biden administration has announced 4 overarching priorities: COVID-19 recovery, economic recovery, racial justice, and climate change. What I will say, and maybe this is pointing out the obvious, that those top 2 bullets will be the primary focus of the White House and the administration, certainly for the next year or 2. But there will be plenty of people in the administration who are paying attention to the last 2 bullets, both of which will have a big impact on environmental law. Go to the next slide, if you would. Some of you probably participated in the seminar that our colleagues in the Policy Resolution Group gave. I'm not going to cover that ground, but I want to focus just a little bit more on what we'll almost certainly see on day 1 or in the weeks thereafter. The Biden transition team have made it clear that on day 1 they will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. I'm sure that the documents are all drafted and will be sent as soon as he takes office. The big issue there, though, is what the U.S. will say. As you all probably remember, each country who was a signatory to that agreement is supposed to set its own target, known as a nationally determined contribution, or NDC. And at this point, it doesn't really make much sense to simply reiterate the Obama NDC, in part because that NDC focused on 2025, and the likelihood that we will actually meet that goal is very low. It was actually probably low even if Trump had not won. But one of the big struggles that they will have is to figure out what they will put forward as the United States target, because the Paris Agreement was not submitted to the Senate for ratification. It is a so-called executive agreement, and the Obama administration took the position that they had all the authority they needed under existing law to reach the targets that they had put forward. So that this administration, a new Biden administration, will need to go through a similar exercise, and they've already said publicly that their goal is to have the United States be carbon neutral by 2050. That's likely to be part of an NDC, but there will also need to be near-term goals, and there'll be lots of I think, discussion and debate in the early weeks and months, because I doubt they will have a new NDC ready to put forward on day one of the administration. We will also see a whole bunch of other things. As the slide says, a slew of executive orders. There are people on the transition team who are already drafting such things. They will revoke many of the Trump administration's executive orders. They will certainly reinstate the interagency working group on the social cost of carbon and begin to use that. There will likely be executive orders creating new government positions. I would guess that every government and agency in the federal government will have someone whose job is to figure out what they can do to address climate change. One of the ideas that's now put forward is there's long been a National Economic Council as part of the White House, and there's talk that they may actually create a parallel National Climate Council. And so we'll see a lot of those things which are organizational and in some ways symbolic, but we will also see an executive order that directs departments and agencies to take certain regulatory actions. And the most important of those will almost certainly be for EPA, because it is EPA and it's the Clean Air Act that really provides them with their most important tools for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Whit, if you could go on to the next slide. I just wanted to quickly mention, I do think that there is possible congressional action, even if the Republicans, as expected, retain control of the Senate. There's bipartisan support for research and development. I think we'll see additional subsidies and tax credits for renewables, for other zero carbon sources. There could very well be an expansion of the credits for electric and zero emission vehicles, clean energy spending, infrastructure investments, including transmission lines for renewables and maybe charging stations. I think there's enough bipartisan support that you will almost certainly see something like that. There is also bipartisan support for carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. Some of you are looking at taking advantage of the 45Q tax credits, and I believe that those will be extended, and there may be additional funding that is authorized and appropriated to support carbon capture and sequestration over the next 4 years. These last two bullets are more of a stretch. I do think, and I think our firm, those of us that are looking at this, believe that there actually is some possibility of a clean energy standard. There's enough utilities who would like to have some long-term certainty. There has been some serious efforts on the Hill to begin to look at something like that. So I'm not going to say it's more likely than not, but I think it's at least possible. More remote is the possibility of a carbon tax. I suspect that all of you are familiar with that concept and with some of the political difficulties that it has encountered, even though that's a favorite of a lot of economists and policy and policy experts. So I wouldn't say it's completely off the table, but I think it's highly unlikely. Okay, if we can go on to the next slide. So maybe I've taken too long to get us to this point, which is, what will the Clean Air Act bring over the next 4 years? And we're going to talk about more specifics on some of the efforts that I think will be of particular interest to the folks listening to this seminar. But let me again start with the big picture in terms of what EPA can do and what it will struggle to do. There are really three main areas of regulatory focus. The first has to do with the transportation sector, with vehicles. This is an area where EPA has clear authority and will certainly use that authority to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from all kinds of vehicles, from cars and trucks to heavy-duty vehicles to off-road vehicles, and here there's no question about EPA's legal authority. And I think the constraint here will be much more political and economic. What will be acceptable to the American public in terms of aggressive standards that could compel the people to buy vehicles that they're not buying today, but certainly that will be a major area of focus and something that will certainly could certainly affect a number of folks in the energy industry. The other area where they are looking at taking possible action would have to do something with low carbon fuels. And some people have suggested there's something they could do under the Renewable Fuel Standard, also under Section 211. There's at least arguable authority for EPA to do something there, and I suspect that we will see something in that area that will be important to pay attention to. The second major area has to do with power generation and the power sector. Here, the agency's authority is much more circumscribed. I think probably everyone on this participating in this seminar remembers the debate over the Clean Power Plan, which was a very creative approach that the Obama EPA came up with to essentially create a cap and trade system. It was not billed that way, but it was certainly designed to shift generation away from especially coal towards renewable sources. As you may remember, that was actually stayed by the Supreme Court. And I think with a newly constituted Supreme Court, it's highly unlikely that that something like the Clean Power Plan would actually stand up in court. And so they will, I think, for political reasons, need to do something for the power sector. One of the ideas that that has been floated is that EPA could actually try to come up with some way to offer safe harbor or streamlined compliance options for utilities that establish their own meaningful commitments and a plan for meeting those. So it may be some combination of a threat of regulation and voluntary measures. But I think a real dilemma facing the Biden administration will be, what do they do? Do they go ahead and try to do something creative that's likely to be struck down in court, or do they do something more modest? The third major focus will be methane emissions from oil and gas operations. And as is the case with vehicles, this is an area where EPA has clear regulatory authority. There's questions about certain findings they may have to make, but my colleague Whit Swift will talk in much more detail about this, but this is something that we will certainly see them embark on in the very early days of the new administration. I just wanted to quickly mention these other two areas. Probably most of you don't pay that much attention to HFCs, but there are certain CFC substitutes that have a very high global warming potential. There's been an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that was negotiated under the Obama years, but actually has widespread support in industry. And whether the U.S. actually ratifies Kigali now, or whether EPA tries to come up with some sort of a regulatory mechanism, I think that will happen. And then finally, the other big area of focus is another area where EPA will struggle. What can they do by regulation under the Clean Air Act to reduce emissions from industrial sources? And as is the case with power generation, I think with these large any kind of industrial sources that are heavy emitters of CO2, that's where EPA's regulatory authority really is constrained. And so they'll look at voluntary measures and other things. But I do think, again, to sum it up, they have clear regulatory authority when it comes to mobile sources, including fuels. They have clear Clean Air Act authority to deal with methane emissions from oil and gas operations. But what to do with major industrial sources, I think, will be a dilemma for them. So that may be more background than you needed, but we wanted to dive into some of the specific areas. And Whit, I know you've been paying a lot of attention to what's going on with methane rules for the oil and gas operations.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. So the new source performance standard for oil and gas sources was widely known as the methane rule due to the step it took in establishing NSPS control requirements for methane. And that was a key part of the Obama EPA's climate efforts. EPA adopted the methane rule in the summer of 2016, months before the election. There was already an NSPS in place for oil and gas sources, but this newer standard applied only to those sources that were constructed or modified or reconstructed after September 2015. And for those newer sources, it established emission standards for methane. It's important to note one wrinkle in this for those of you who are not familiar with the rule. And that is that while the methane rule established standards and regulated emissions of methane from oil and gas sources, it did not actually establish emission standards for methane that were different from the standards that were used to control VOC emissions from those same sources. So, for example, the emissions control requirements for fugitive emissions that were identified as methane controls, those same practices were identified in the rule as VOC control measures. And while the regulation of methane in the NSPS may not have added substantive control requirements, the regulation of methane in that NSPS under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act did provide a basis for regulating emissions of that same pollutant under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act for existing sources. And the Obama EPA started down that path, sending out an information collection request to the owners and operators of existing oil and gas sources aimed at collecting information that would be used in establishing a best system of emissions reduction standard, or BSER standard, that would apply under Section 111D for the control of methane emissions from existing oil and gas sources. That ICR was sent out in November of 2016. But as I'm sure you know, following the election, the trajectory on regulating methane emissions from the oil and gas industry changed. EPA announced a formal reconsideration of the methane rule. It withdrew the ICR and said that there was no obligation to respond, and then began a long series of regulatory actions. I'll spare you the detail on the various administrative and regulatory stays and delays and the court battles surrounding those changes, but the key step for our discussion is where we just recently ended up. And that is that in a final rule signed in September, EPA rescinded the methane requirements from NSPS subpart Quad OA. So as of that final rule, it is no longer the methane rule. And again, those revisions did not actually make substantive changes to the emissions control requirements for those sources that are subject to Quad OA. All of the same control measures that were in place that they had to implement before the recent change are still in place because they're required for the control of VOCs. But methane is no longer regulated for oil and gas sources under the NSPS, and as a result, there's no longer that hook for regulation under Clean Air Act Section 111D for regulating methane from existing oil and gas sources. But as Jeff has discussed in detail, the Biden administration has pledged to take aggressive action on greenhouse gases and on the emissions of methane from the oil and gas sector in particular. And these recently adopted changes to the methane rule are an obvious target. So we certainly expect the new administration to look to reestablish that the NSPS regulates methane from new oil and gas sources. And other statements by the incoming administration make it clear that it's not just new sources that they'll be looking at, but the existing sources as well. So look for an aggressive return toward regulating methane emissions from existing sources under Clean Air Act Section 111D. One interesting question here will relate, of course, to the timeline, particularly on the existing source rule and the steps necessary to move forward for regulating existing sources. Back in 2016, the Obama EPA had described the information collection request process as a necessary step toward regulating methane from existing sources. And there will be a lot of pressure for EPA to move rapidly on this, and I suspect pressure to move forward without the lengthy ICR process. And whether a Biden EPA will re-up the ICR or a different ICR remains to be seen. But in either event, ICR or no, we should certainly expect and look for action toward developing GHG emission standards from all sources in the oil and gas industry and on a fairly aggressive timeline. And one other thing I'll point out before we move on is that EPA is not required to wait until it has again regulated methane for new sources before it can move forward with existing source regulation. So this is not something that has to be sequential and EPA go through the full regulatory process to make changes to subpart quad OA and then embark on existing source regulation. In fact, they can move forward on more of a parallel track. And so again, you would expect this administration to do so. Now I'll pass it back to Jeff, and we'll hear about some other Clean Air Act measures that could be on the table relating to climate change.
Thanks, Whit. Just one more note about methane from oil and gas operations. Many of you are probably aware that the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, has focused a lot of attention on that issue. And what I would say is I expect that EDF and its recommendations will have a lot of credibility with the Biden administration. So you may want to be aware of what EDF has been doing and been saying in that area. I wanted to just quickly note the fact that over the past decade, there have been much more ambitious proposals for using the Clean Air Act to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular with CO2 emissions. At one point, there were several academic papers arguing that EPA could actually set a national ambient air quality standard for GHGs. And I won't go to any details about how that would actually work, but they have a fairly detailed sort of presentation of how that whole process might work. And then after the Paris Climate Agreement was signed, there was a big law review article that came out. It was signed by a number of law professors from around the country, arguing that now that the U.S. was a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord, that they would therefore have authority under Section 115 of the Clean Air Act to implement a nationwide cap and trade program for greenhouse gases. I'm not going to spend any time on these two, except to say I think they were creative, but I think they were pretty far-fetched and probably would not have passed muster in the courts. But I can say with great confidence that neither of those ideas would pass muster with the current Supreme Court. We have enough statements from Republican appointees that they believe that it's Congress who should make big decisions and that agencies should not be able to discover vast new regulatory powers without congressional blessing. So ultimately, in terms of regulatory reform, in terms of preventing future administrations from perhaps misusing the Clean Air Act, the Supreme Court may be the Trump administration's most enduring regulatory reform. So don't hold your breath for an axe for CO2 or a nationwide cap and program under Section 115. Okay, but if you could go on to the next slide. Climate will be a focus of the administration. There's no doubt about that. But there are other key Clean Air Act issues that they will need to address, and we just wanted to cover three that are, I think, of interest and importance to everyone. Of course, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the NAAQS, are at the heart of the Clean Air Act. They drive a lot of other regulatory activity, as those of you in Texas certainly know. And the Trump administration has very quickly done its review of these two standards for ozone and for PM 2.5. They have not issued final rules yet, but they will certainly do so before they leave office. I believe that the PM 2.5, the NAAQS will likely come out in early December, and ozone by the end of December, or certainly before January 20th. And those will be final rules that keep the current standards in place. So the question is, what will a Biden administration do with these NAAQS? They will certainly be able to come in. Those NAAQS will not have been effective yet. If they choose to, they could revisit those decisions. And I think that they will certainly revisit the decision for PM 2.5, but maybe not for ozone. Whit, if you could go on to the next slide quickly. Many of you, well, probably not that many of us go back to 79, but this is a rough history of the ozone NAAQS. Going back to 1997, I would actually point out that even though it's listed as 0.08 ppm, it was actually 84 parts per billion. So it's gone from 84 in 1997 to 75 in 2008, to 70 in 2015, and now in 2020, EPA will keep that same number. States throughout the country have struggled to meet the ozone standard for decades, and additional pollution reductions, additional reductions in ozone in many parts of the country will be very difficult and costly, and there are real economic consequences from having new areas designated as non-attainment. For that reason, I think there is a good chance that they will decide simply to leave the ozone standard in place. The EPA staff experts recommended that, and even though the environmental community urged the administration to lower the ozone standard, as I said, the EPA staff folks recommended that it remain at 70, and simply because of the economic and the political blowback they might get from lowering the ozone standard, I think there's a fairly good chance that they will leave the ozone standard in place. And then, Whit, if you go on to PM, the next slide, the EPA for the first time set a standard for fine particles for PM 2.5 in 1997. And here's the history of that and how it has come down over time. EPA believes and has stated in numerous ways that reducing concentrations of PM 2.5 is by far the most important environmental action that the agency has taken. Virtually all of the benefits that they claim for a wide variety of rules actually come from the co-benefits of reducing levels of PM 2.5. I think there is quite a good chance that a Biden administration will reconsider the Trump rule on PM 2.5 and lower the standard for PM 2.5. So I would anticipate that although ozone may remain where it has been, that the PM 2.5 levels will go down from 12 micrograms per cubic meter, probably to probably to 10, but that will require a process. It will take a little while, but I think that we will see more action on the PM 2.5 standard. Okay, Whit, I think the next item on the agenda was yours, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. We have talked a lot about climate change and the focus on climate change efforts, and then Jeff's discussion of NAAQS. And I'm going to shift gears here to another air rule that presents an opportunity for the Biden administration to get a win on another important campaign pledge that it made, and that is environmental justice. And the rule is the Risk Management Plan rule. For those of you that don't deal with the rule or are not familiar with the rule, it's promulgated under Clean Air Act Section 112 relating to hazardous air pollutants. And the RMP rule is about identifying the risks associated with accidental releases of hazardous air pollutants, preventing such accidents from occurring, and responding to those accidents when they do occur. The substantive elements of the RMP rule that relate to preventing these accidents largely overlap with OSHA's Process Safety Management, or PSM, program. And following a series of high-profile industrial accidents, EPA had embarked on a lengthy process of looking at potential changes to the RMP program and finally adopted some pretty extensive changes to the program in January 2017, right on its way out the door. Those January 2017 changes, as you can see here on the slide, can largely be divided into two basic categories. One group of accident prevention program changes and one group of emergency response program changes. On the accident prevention program, they affected the auditing requirement under the RMP program. For one, there was a new requirement to conduct third-party audits as opposed to just internal audits in certain situations. That is, following what they call an RMP reportable accident, and also when directed by the regulating agency. There was also some changes to the scope of the audit requirement. Sites that are subject to RMP will typically, particularly large sites, will use the evaluation or analysis of a representative group of sources to conduct those audits. And the regulatory change was more explicit about this audit, which must be conducted every few years, covering each covered process. So again, a potential change to that audit, the scope of those audits. There were changes to the requirements regarding the incident investigations that occur and expanding them under the rule to be required after a near miss event, and also an explicit requirement to include a root cause analysis as part of those investigations. There was also a new requirement to conduct a Safer Technologies and Alternatives Analysis, or STAA. This is part of the periodic process hazard analysis that's required under the RMP program, and it was adding a new element to that PHA process that involves the consideration of inherently safer systems in evaluating the safety of your processes. And last, there were some relatively broad information sharing requirements that called for categories of information to be made available to the public upon request. That's now look at that second category of information, the emergency response program changes. So the 2017 amendments established enhanced coordination requirements with local emergency responders. They established a new requirement to hold a public meeting after an RMP reportable accident had occurred. And then there were several new sort of drill and exercise requirements added to the RMP program. These annual notification drills, again, working on the notifications that would be made to emergency responders in the event of an accident, and then to conduct tabletop exercises, as well as less frequent field exercises to, essentially practice on emergency response. So you've had a slew of changes that EPA made to the RMP program at the very end of the Obama administration. And it's also worth noting that in making these changes, EPA got out ahead of OSHA on these topics, because OSHA, which was at least on paper evaluating similar changes to the PSM program, did not make changes in lockstep with EPA here on the RMP rule. But shortly after the new administration took office in 2017, it announced reconsideration of those RMP amendments, and it began pursuing various administrative and regulatory delays and stays of the new changes. Again, I'll spare all the detail of those actions and the largely successful judicial challenges to those delay actions, but key for our purposes is that EPA did engage in a lengthy reconsideration rule process, and that reconsideration rule process culminated in a final rule that EPA adopted in December of last year. And that rule did not completely undo the 2017 changes to the RMP program. It rescinded it rescinded the accident prevention program changes that were made in 2017, but it retained the emergency response program changes. So the coordination, the drills, the exercises, the public meeting, those requirements all stayed in the rule after it had its Trump era reconsideration. The compliance deadlines for those requirements was extended as part of that reconsideration rule, but those new elements all remained in the RMP rule when it was amended in December of 2019. And when EPA adopted those changes, even though many of the response program elements stayed in the rule, that move was attacked by a number of environmental justice groups. The RMP program is aimed at preventing large industrial accidents that involve the release of hazardous air pollutants. And fence line communities are at particular risk for those types of accidents. And so EJ groups attacked EPA for those rollbacks. And as a result, I think that those changes that were made in 2019 will be a focus for the new Biden administration. In campaigning, the Biden campaign expressed a lot of interest in environmental justice issues, and they talked about making significant investments into environmental justice programs. I think particularly if we end up with a divided Congress, the investment parts of those could be more difficult based on whether they would need changes to the tax laws or the like. Again, if you don't have a Democratic controlled Congress, and that they'll be looking hard for wins on other fronts. And so here, I think these RMP changes from 2019 present a Trump era deregulatory action that, if it was reversed, could give the Biden administration an opportunity to claim a win in the environmental justice space for its supporters. So here again, you've got a non-climate Clean Air Act matter where we can expect to see early action from the Biden administration, and where the regulated community will have an opportunity to get involved and try to influence where that rule is headed. Whether, if EPA is looking at bringing back the accident prevention program changes that were rescinded in December 2019, looking at those changes that are going to be evaluated for bringing those back into the rule, and are there ways to change those requirements such that they would be a smarter way to achieve that same goal of accident prevention. But I think that this is something that the new administration will be looking at, and there will be opportunities for the regulated community in the return of those requirements to impact, ultimately their changes, those changes to the RMP rule and compliance obligations for those sites that are subject to RMP going forward. Jeff, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Whit. In looking at my notes, there's one other thing about climate change that I did want to mention that I think is worthwhile. The Climate 21 project report, I think, is noteworthy because of the credibility it will have with the new Biden administration. The authors of this report are many of them are senior officials, or were senior officials in the Obama administration. They come from academia, but from really credible, thoughtful sources, not necessarily from an advocacy group. They make a number of recommendations to the Biden administration about things they can do to address climate change, and their report is easy to find on the internet, and I think it's probably worth reading. One thing I did want to specifically call attention to from that report is what they say about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the industrial sector. They essentially acknowledge that will be hard for EPA to do through regulatory means. And they recommend that when it comes to the industrial sector, non-power plant sector, that the White House should create a task force to look at both regulatory and non-regulatory approaches for reducing GHG emissions from the power sector. Whether or not the White House adopts that approach and actually creates a task force at the White House, there will be some engagement from the new administration with individual industrial sectors, whether that's simply done by EPA, whether that's done through the auspices of the White House or otherwise. But I think all of us should anticipate that there will be this type of outreach and an effort to engage in discussions and ideas about not only strictly voluntary things that companies may choose to do, but ways in which the government could support those actions. So I think I know some of you are already thinking about these issues, but I think definitely there will be there will be opportunities to engage with the new administration on those issues, and not necessarily sort of just anticipate that they may try to do something under the Clean Air Act or under Section 111D. All right, switching gears again. In terms of what to expect over the next 4 years, we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention the New Source Review Program. Those of you who have attended our seminars over the last 4 years know that we have talked in some detail about a number of NSR reforms that have been undertaken under the Trump administration. The first head of the Air Office under the Trump administration, Bill Wareham, said publicly that his strategy for dealing with NSR was to try to hit singles and doubles, meaning to do sort of reforms one at a time, not to try to do them in one big rule, but to look at where reforms could be made by guidance documents, through applicability determinations, and other things. And there's quite a long list of those, and I'm not going to go over each one of them in detail, but I think all of those have been subject to criticism, and most of them have been subject to litigation from the environmental community. And there will certainly be pressure from environmental activist groups to undo maybe all of those reforms, but certainly some of them. But I think that some of these reforms will likely stay in place. And one of the reasons I say that is because many of them were ideas and things that the EPA career staff had been working on for many years, things that they thought were sensible reforms. Now, of course, ultimately the decisions will be made by the political appointees, but the career staff also has the ability to influence the thinking there. And simply because Earth Justice or the Sierra Club is calling for the new administration to do something doesn't mean that they will actually follow through. I mean, some things will certainly be undone. I mean, one example of that, I think, is the reversal of the once in, always in policy. That's not actually an NSR reform, but it's often mentioned in that same category. This administration is actually going to finalize a rule to undo the once and always in policy. But I think because that has been sort of so important symbolically, I think they will undo that. Unfortunately, I think they will probably undo the rule on project netting, although I think the staff supports that and thinks it just simplifies things. But that's one where I think there'll be enough pressure from in the environmental community. But what I would say is each of these NSR reforms sort of stands on its own, and some of them may actually remain in place and not simply be reversed by the new Biden administration. Finally, I wanted to just make a comment about the relationship between political appointees and career staff at EPA. My experience, both in the private sector and as the head of the EPA Air Office for 5 years, is that for the most part, the career staff really represent the best in true civil servants, and they view their job as trying to find the best way to support the priorities of the political leadership. They may raise issues, they may raise concerns, but ultimately, when decisions are made, they work very hard to try to make sure that those are done in a thoughtful and legally defensible way. And I think they work just as hard under Republican administrations as they do under Democratic administrations. Many of the same people who have been involved in these reforms will be called upon to undo them, and I think that their insights may guide the political leadership, and I think in some ways the best opportunities to influence the new administration will in many cases be through the career staff, because although they do implement the decisions made by political leadership, they also have the ability to push back and even to shape the agenda in some ways. So I think that and many of you have relationships with officials at OAQPS and other parts of the EPA Air Office. And I think all of those relationships will be important. And of course, I do think a Biden administration will certainly be willing to engage with industry, even though the environmental community will undoubtedly have more influence than it has had over the last 4 years. So we now I think come to the end of our program, and Whit, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you again for joining us this morning to discuss what's next under the Clean Air Act. And please join Bracewell again in the first Tuesday after Thanksgiving for a similar session about what's next under the Clean Water Act. That session, titled The Good, the Bad, and the Muddy, will set you straight as far as what to expect with Clean Water Act developments under the new administration. Thank you again, and have a great day.